Pam Bondi's got one mission: take down the cartels and stop the fentanyl crisis that's tearing America apart. But she's up against more than just drugs. Betrayal, deadly risks, and a ticking clock are all in the mix. Can she pull it off before it's too late? Watch to the end. You won't believe what happens next. Chapter 1. A Deal with the Devil. Pam Bondi sat behind her desk in Washington, D.C., staring down a mountain of paperwork that felt more like a tombstone than a to-do list. The weight of the office, of everything that came with it, pressed down on her chest. But today? Today wasn't about the usual political nonsense. Today was personal. The fentanyl crisis had reached a breaking point. Overdoses were spiking every day, families were burying their children, and the streets were flooded with poison. She couldn't pretend like this was just another bureaucratic issue. Pam knew that if she didn't act now, the country would crumble under the weight of this epidemic. But who was she kidding? In Washington, it wasn't about saving lives, it was about playing the game. And that wasn't Pam's style. Not today. Her phone rang, and she didn't even look at the ID. She knew what it was. Another call, another family shattered by the epidemic. She picked up without hesitation. "Ms. Bondi," a woman's voice cracked over the line. My son's gone. He died from fentanyl. I can't breathe without him." Pam's heart tightened. She'd heard this too many times: mothers, fathers, siblings, all victims of this war. The words hit like a gut punch, but Pam didn't flinch. She had to stay focused. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," Pam said, her voice low, calm, but firm. "I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to stop this. But I need you to know something. Your son's death won't be in vain. We're fighting for him." She hung up and sat in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Pam wasn't just a political figure anymore. She was a mother, a daughter. She wasn't just fighting for votes. She was fighting for every single American family torn apart by this poison. Her fingers hovered over the phone again, but this time, it wasn't a grieving mother on the other end. No, this call would be different. This call could change everything. "Mr. President," she said when he picked up, her voice steady but urgent, "we've got a war on our hands. And it's time to fight like it." There was a pause. She could hear the faint shuffle of papers on the other side of the line, the rustle of someone who didn't quite understand the gravity of the situation. Then, Trump's voice, thick with authority, cut through the silence. "Do what you gotta do, Pam. I trust you." It was a simple answer, but that was all she needed. The green light. The nod from the top. Now, she wasn't just one voice crying in the wind, she had the president's backing. This was going to be a battle. No more excuses. No more playing nice. Pam's eyes narrowed as she hung up the phone. The decision she was about to make would shake the foundation of this nation, but she wasn't afraid. She had a job to do, and this was bigger than politics. Fentanyl wasn't just a drug, it was a war, and Pam Bondi was ready to fight. But as she looked out the window, watching the chaos unfold in the streets below, one question lingered in her mind. How far was she willing to go to win? Chapter 2. The Cartel's Grip. Pam Bondi stood over the maps spread out on the conference room table, the weight of the moment crashing down on her like a freight train. Pins marked the locations where fentanyl overdoses had exploded, places like the U.S.-Mexico border, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. She ran her finger across the map, tracing the sickening lines of death that snaked across the country. There was a pattern, and it was as clear as day. The Sinaloa Cartel's fingerprints were all over it. And if Pam was going to take this fight to the heart of the beast, she had to act fast. "This isn't just about drugs," Pam muttered, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at the room full of law enforcement officials. "It's about a war being waged on our streets. And we're losing." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with the tension that filled the room. She wasn't playing games anymore. This wasn't some policy debate in a stuffy office. People were dying. The Sinaloa Cartel had unleashed hell on America, and Pam wasn't about to stand by and watch it burn. One of the agents, a hardened veteran of the DEA, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We've known about this for years, Pam," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But every time we get close, they pull back into the shadows. We can't go in guns blazing without solid intel. We don't want a disaster on our hands." Pam slammed her fist on the table, making everyone jump. "I'm done waiting for perfect intel. The clock's ticking. Every day we do nothing, another mother loses her son, another daughter's gone forever. We're not sitting back and letting this slide. We're going after the heart of this." The room went silent. Pam's eyes locked on each person in the room, daring them to question her. They all knew the stakes, but her words, her conviction, sent a chill down their spines. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. But then, just as the tension hit its peak, a phone rang. It was a number Pam didn't recognize, and when she picked up, her gut told her it wasn't good news. "Ms. Bondi, we've got a shipment." A big one, the voice on the other end crackled. "It's the cartel. They're sending everything they've got into Philly tonight. We're tracking it. But we need backup. Fast." Pam's blood ran cold. This was it. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was the real deal. If they didn't stop the shipment, it could flood the streets with enough fentanyl to take out hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. Without a second thought, she snapped into action. "Get me the team. We're going in, and we're going in hard. No half measures. We hit them tonight." She hung up the phone and looked around the room. The agents were already moving, gathering their gear, eyes wide with the kind of intensity you get when the stakes are higher than you ever thought they'd be. Pam wasn't just making a speech now. She was leading the charge. "Listen up," she said, her voice cold but sharp. "We're going after the cartel leaders. No more pussyfooting around. This is war, and we're going to take it to them." As Pam walked out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more dangerous. The cartel wasn't going to go down without a fight, and she was about to step straight into the lion's den. But she wasn't afraid. She had a job to do, and she was willing to put everything on the line to see it through. This wasn't just about drugs. It was about saving a nation, and Pam Bondi wasn't going to let anyone or anything stand in her way. Chapter 3: Undercover Shadows. Pam Bondi paced the room, her eyes scanning the intel laid out in front of her. The operation was underway, but it wasn't going to be as simple as marching in and shutting things down. The cartel was smart. They were always 3 steps ahead. And right now, the only thing standing between her team and a full-scale disaster was a single undercover agent embedded deep in their ranks. The agent, codenamed Ghost, had been working for months, feeding back critical info about the cartel's operations. But the closer they got to the heart of it, the big players, the real power behind the drug empire, the more dangerous it became. Every move was being watched. Every phone call was a risk. "Pam, we've got a problem," Agent Miller, the head of the task force, said as he stepped into the room, his face grim. "Ghost sent us a message. He's in deep, too deep. The cartel's starting to suspect someone in their ranks is a mole. They're tightening the net." Pam's stomach twisted. She'd known the risks from the start. But this was different. If Ghost was compromised, the whole operation could fall apart. And if the cartel found out about the team's involvement, there'd be hell to pay. No one wanted to get caught in their crosshairs. "What's the plan?" Pam asked, her voice low and steady, though her mind raced 1,000 miles a minute. "We need to pull him out now," Miller replied, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "But it's not going to be easy. They know we're coming for them. They're ready to move." Pam clenched her fists. She didn't like pulling out, not when they were this close. But she knew Miller was right. If they didn't act fast, they'd lose their only chance to take down the cartel. "Not yet," Pam snapped, her voice hardening. "We push forward. Ghost stays in. We can't risk exposing him or pulling the trigger on this too soon. We've got a window, and we're taking it." But as soon as the words left her mouth, her phone buzzed. The number was unknown, but something in her gut told her it wasn't good news. She answered, her heart thumping. "Pam, this is Delta One," a voice crackled. "We've got intel. Someone on the inside is leaking information. They know about Ghost. It's too risky. They're closing in." Pam's blood ran cold. She knew this wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. A cold, calculated reminder that she wasn't just fighting the cartels. She was fighting a system that was rotting from the inside out. "Get me Ghost," Pam ordered, her voice ice cold. "Now." There was a long pause before the response came, laced with tension. "He's not answering. We've lost contact." Pam's mind raced. If they lost Ghost, they lost everything. She could already see the headlines. Another botched operation, another failure. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not on her watch. "We can't wait any longer," Pam said, slamming her fist on the table. "We move in, now. No more waiting. Ghost is on his own, but we're not leaving him behind." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every person there. "We either take them down tonight, or they walk free to kill again. And we're not letting that happen." As her team mobilized, Pam's mind raced with what-ifs, but there was no time for hesitation. They were in too deep. The stakes had never been higher. The cartel was closing in, but so was Pam. This was the moment. Everything they had worked for came down to tonight. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. The clock was ticking, and the shadow of the cartel loomed larger by the second. "Let's finish this," Pam muttered under her breath as she grabbed her gear and headed for the door. The operation had entered its final phase, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 4: The Silent War. The room was filled with tension. Pam sat at the table, staring down at the pile of reports in front of her. Numbers, statistics, facts, none of it was good. Each page seemed to carry a heavier weight than the last. She'd seen the data: 105,000 Americans dead from fentanyl in just a single year. Overdoses were ripping families apart, turning neighborhoods into war zones, and the streets were drowning in the poison that cartels had unleashed. Beside her, Virginia's Attorney General, Jason Miyares, leaned in. He had the same fire in his eyes, the same sense of urgency that had fueled Pam from day one. "This isn't just a public health issue anymore," Jason said, his voice low and serious. "This is a national security threat. We need the president's backing full throttle, no more half measures." Pam's eyes narrowed as she looked up at him. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but there was no backing down now. The moment for talk was over. "We've been playing catch-up for too long," Pam shot back, her voice hardening with every word. "We need a full-on assault. If we don't do this now, it's over. We lose the fight. We lose everything." Jason's face was tense. "And what if we can't get the president's backing? What if the political machine grinds this to a halt? We're already facing opposition. The system isn't exactly built for this kind of war." Pam slammed her fist on the table, her frustration rising. "Then we fight harder. If the president won't give us the green light, we make it happen anyway. This isn't about politics, it's about saving lives. How many more people have to die before we stop pretending this isn't a war?" Jason looked at her, weighing her words. "So, you're saying you're willing to risk everything, political fallout, your career, just to stop this?" Pam met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't get into this for the politics. I got in to make a difference. This isn't a game anymore. This is real life. And every single day we do nothing, we're losing a war we can't afford to lose." Jason exhaled slowly. "You know what? I'm with you. But you need the president's full backing. If you can't get that, you're fighting an uphill battle." Pam's mind raced. She needed more than just lip service from Washington. She needed action. But Washington was broken, and she couldn't afford to wait for everyone else to catch up. The room went quiet, the weight of the conversation settling in. Pam's phone buzzed on the table, the harsh sound breaking the silence. She snatched it up, glancing at the screen. A text message from one of her team members read, 105,000 dead in just 1 year. "This is bigger than all of us." Her heart sank, but the fire in her chest only grew hotter. This was personal now. This wasn't just a headline. This wasn't some statistic on a piece of paper. This was real. Real people, real families torn apart by something they couldn't control. And Pam wasn't going to let it slide. Her eyes locked onto Jason's. "We can't afford to wait for the president. We need to go now. This fight has already started. If we don't act, it's going to destroy us from the inside out." Jason nodded, his jaw set. "Then let's make sure we don't lose." Pam stood, taking a deep breath. She wasn't in this for the praise or the headlines. She was in this for every parent who buried their kid too soon. For every community where fentanyl was poisoning the streets. For every life that still had a chance, if they could just stop the wave. The clock was ticking. If they didn't stop the cartels now, the war would only get worse. And Pam wasn't about to let that happen. "Let's make this happen," she said, her voice steely with resolve. And with that, Pam knew she was diving deeper into a fight she might never come back from. But there was no turning back. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when so many lives were hanging in the balance. The war for America's future had already begun. Chapter 5: A Deal with China. Pam Bondi stood behind the podium, facing a sea of reporters, their cameras flashing like a storm. The pressure was palpable, the weight of the nation's crisis hanging in the air. Her hands were steady, but inside, her pulse was racing. She had one shot to make this right, one chance to take a stand. "Let's be clear," she began, her voice cutting through the noise. "The fentanyl crisis is not just a domestic issue, it's an international war. And the biggest player in this war? China." The room went silent, the reporters leaning in, waiting for the bombshell. "China is the source of most of the fentanyl flooding into this country," Pam continued, her gaze never wavering. "And we need to hold them accountable." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't some random accusation. This was Pam Bondi, the voice of reason in the chaos, calling out the world's most dangerous nation. No one had said it so bluntly before. The question was, would anyone listen? The questions started coming fast and hard. How do you plan to stop China, Pam? One reporter asked, the skepticism thick in their tone. They're one of the world's superpowers. What can we really do about it? Pam leaned in, her eyes locking onto the reporter. We'll use every tool we've got: tariffs, sanctions, diplomatic pressure. But we're not stopping there. We're going to expose them for what they are: enablers of death. The room was buzzing now. This wasn't the soft rhetoric they were used to hearing from politicians. This was different. This was war. And if that doesn't work, another reporter pressed. What then? Pam's jaw tightened. If they don't stop, we'll make them. We're going after the heart of the problem. If China keeps sending fentanyl to our shores, they'll face the consequences. Period. She felt the shift in the room. There was no mistaking it. Pam wasn't just talking about a trade war. She was talking about a fight for the future of her country. And she wasn't about to back down. How do you convince the president to back you on this? One reporter asked, their voice almost accusing. Pam took a breath, the weight of the question hanging heavy. We're already talking, she replied. The president knows this is a threat. But this isn't about politics. This is about saving lives. If we don't act now, it's going to get worse. Pam could feel the heat from the cameras, the pressure mounting. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not when she knew what was at stake. The numbers were real: 105,000 dead in a year. And that wasn't just a statistic. Those were people. People who had families, who had lives that were cut short by a poison coming from overseas. But China wasn't going to play fair. She knew that. And if the U.S. was going to stand a chance, they needed to fight dirty too. The next day, as Pam sat in her office, the phone rang. She picked it up, bracing herself. It was an encrypted line, one that only her most trusted contacts used. She listened intently as the voice on the other end spoke, and the words hit her like a ton of bricks. We've got confirmation, the voice said. China's government is directly involved. They're pushing fentanyl shipments through state-run ports. Pam's stomach twisted. This was worse than she'd imagined. The Chinese government wasn't just turning a blind eye. They were actively enabling the destruction of American lives. We've got to move fast, Pam said, her voice now firm, resolute. We're not just dealing with criminals anymore. We're dealing with a regime that has blood on its hands. She slammed down the phone, her mind racing. It was time to take the gloves off. No more waiting for the world to get its act together. Pam was going to make sure the world knew exactly who was fueling this crisis. But as she stared out the window, watching the hustle and bustle of Washington, one thing was clear: China had just made this personal. And Pam Bondi wasn't going to rest until the whole world knew what they'd done. The fight had just entered a new phase. And this time, there was no turning back. Chapter 6, in the streets. Pam Bondi's boots hit the cracked pavement as she stepped into the heart of Philadelphia's worst drug zones. The stench of desperation was thick in the air, mingling with the burnt-out smell of street corners where deals were done in plain sight. It was a far cry from the polished halls of Washington, but this was the reality, the front lines of the war she was waging. She was flanked by local cops, their faces grim, their eyes hardened by years of fighting battles they knew they were losing. They were used to the chaos, but even they knew that things had gotten worse in the last few months. The fentanyl pouring in from every corner of the world had made these streets a battlefield. We need to shut these markets down, Pam said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. These dealers, these suppliers, they're the enemy. And I'm not leaving until we take them down. The officer walking beside her, Detective Rios, grunted in agreement. This is bigger than we've ever seen, Pam. These guys have no fear. They'll do anything to protect their turf. Pam's eyes scanned the street, the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminating the darkened alleyways. She could hear the distant chatter of radios and the shuffle of boots on the pavement, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. These markets are the lifeblood of the cartels, she said. If we shut them down, we cut off the supply. But we can't just arrest these low-level guys and call it a win. We need to get to the source. The street corner they were on was packed with people, some just looking to get by, others too deep into the mess to get out. Pam felt a pang of guilt for the families caught in the crossfire, but she couldn't focus on that now. She had a job to do. As they walked past a group of men huddled together near a rundown store, one of them shot her a look. Pam's instincts kicked in, and she met his eyes, unflinching. The man quickly turned away, his face darkening as if he knew the game was up. Pam felt the tension in the air rise. This wasn't just a neighborhood, this was enemy territory. But she wasn't backing down. As they rounded the corner, a car skidded to a stop in front of them. The door opened, and a man in a hoodie stepped out, his hands raised. Detective Rios, he called out, his voice frantic. You gotta see this. Rios motioned for Pam to follow as they jogged toward the alley. The man led them to a dumpster where a group of officers were gathered, staring at something on the ground. Pam's stomach churned when she saw what they were looking at, a small pile of empty vials, each one marked with a strange symbol. The stuff inside wasn't just any drug, it was fentanyl, the kind that had been ravaging the streets. And someone was making it look like a regular shipment. That symbol, Rios muttered, crouching down to examine the vials. That's from a known supplier. These guys are getting smart. They're trying to cover their tracks. Pam's heart dropped. This wasn't just about random dealers anymore. They were up against something bigger, an operation so deeply embedded that even the cops on the ground couldn't tell who was in charge. We need to find out where this came from, Pam said, her jaw clenched. And I don't care how many toes we have to step on. We're going after them all. Just then, a woman approached them, her face drawn with exhaustion. Please, you gotta help us, she said, her voice trembling. My daughter, she overdosed this morning. She was just a kid. Pam felt a pit form in her stomach. The woman's face was etched with pain, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse. Pam had seen this before too many times. Another family torn apart by the very poison they were fighting to stop. We're fighting for families like yours, Pam said softly, her voice thick with emotion. We won't stop until we bring these people to justice. As the woman nodded and walked away, Pam's heart hardened. There was no time for emotions. Not now. The streets were a war zone, and it was time for her team to make its move. She turned to the officers. We can't let this go on. We need to shut these markets down, no matter what it takes. The team nodded, and Pam knew this was just the beginning. The war on fentanyl wasn't going to be won on the streets of Philadelphia alone. It would take everything they had. But she was ready. She had no choice. Chapter 7, The Betrayal. Pam Bondi stormed through the dimly lit hallway of the government building, her heels clicking against the cold, sterile tiles. The air felt thick with tension. She could feel it, the weight of everything crashing down on her, the strain of trying to keep it all together. But today, something had changed. The familiar voice on the other end of the line earlier had sent chills down her spine, and she knew right then that everything she'd worked for was in jeopardy. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, an encrypted message from one of her most trusted agents. The message read, We've got a mole. Someone's been leaking info to the cartel. Pam's blood ran cold. A mole? She was just starting to get a grip on this war, and now the very people she trusted were turning on her? There was no way this could be happening. Her fists clenched as she turned the corner and entered the command room. Her team was already there, faces tense, eyes darting as they scrambled to coordinate the next move. But Pam didn't care about the next move. Not now. She slammed her hand down on the table, silencing the room. We've got a problem, Pam snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. Someone in this room is working with the cartels. The room went dead silent. Every pair of eyes locked onto hers. Everyone knew what was at stake, and the last thing they needed was a traitor in their ranks. A young agent, one of the newer recruits, spoke up hesitantly. How do you know? Pam stared him down, her gaze cold as ice. Because this wasn't a random leak. They knew about our operation in Philly before we even made a move. Someone's been feeding them intel. The tension in the room was palpable now. Whispers broke out as agents exchanged looks, fear creeping into their eyes. Who could it be? And why hadn't they noticed sooner? Who's got access to the intel? Pam demanded, her voice like steel. We've all got access, Miller, her lead agent, said, rubbing his temples as if he had a headache. But no one would, not without a damn good reason. Pam's eyes narrowed as she scanned the faces in front of her. If you're not with me, you're against me. I need to know who's playing both sides before this all falls apart. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Pam was about to demand answers again when her phone buzzed again. She grabbed it with trembling fingers, already knowing that it wasn't going to be good news. Pam, it's bad, the voice on the other end said, almost breathless. We've traced the leaks. It's someone inside the White House. Pam's stomach dropped. The White House? She had trusted people at the highest levels. Now it was all slipping through her fingers. Who? She asked, barely able to keep the fear out of her voice. We don't know yet, but we've got enough to go after them. It's just a matter of time before it all comes out. Pam slammed the phone down on the table, her fists trembling. She'd been betrayed by someone in her own camp, and she was damn sure going to find out who. Okay, Pam said, her voice hard and decisive. Here's what we're going to do. We find the mole, and we do whatever it takes to shut them down. I don't care how high up they are. If they're working with the cartels, they're a threat to everything we're fighting for." Miller nodded grimly. "You know we can't let this slide. But if this goes public—" "I don't care." Pam cut him off, her voice rising with the weight of her frustration. "This isn't about politics anymore. It's about saving lives. I'll burn every bridge in Washington if that's what it takes to get this done." As Pam's team began to mobilize, the anger inside her built to a boiling point. She trusted these people with her life, with the lives of countless Americans, and now one of them had turned on her. Whoever it was, they had to be stopped. The room emptied, and Pam stood alone, staring at the map of fentanyl overdoses pinned to the wall. It was clear now this wasn't just a fight against the cartels. This was a battle on two fronts. The streets were a war zone, but Washington had just become a battlefield too. And Pam was ready for both. But the question still lingered in her mind. Who could she trust now? The very system she was fighting to protect had just turned against her. Chapter 8. The Final Blow. Pam Bondi stood on the edge of the operation, staring at the clock ticking down in front of her. The final raid was set to go down in just hours. The entire team was in position. Every agent, every resource was in place to take down the heart of the Sinaloa Cartel. This was it, the moment that could either define her legacy or destroy everything she'd worked for. Her heart was racing. It had all come down to this. The betrayal, the leaks, the endless political games. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, it was all about bringing this war to an end. The cartel was about to get a taste of the fury that had been building in Pam for months. "We're ready to move," Pam, Miller said, his voice low as he approached her. He was always the calm in the chaos, but even he looked tense tonight. This wasn't just another raid. It was the culmination of everything. The stakes had never been higher. Pam nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She glanced at the map one last time, tracing the locations where they'd hit. She knew where the cartel's leaders were holed up, and she knew this was their last shot to take them down. If they failed now, they'd never get another chance. She turned to Miller. "No mistakes. No one gets out of there alive unless they've got something to offer." Miller's eyes flickered, but he didn't argue. He knew the cost of failure. The cartel wasn't going to go down quietly, and they'd do anything to protect their empire. As the team prepped for the raid, Pam took one last look at the intel. Everything was in place. The cartel was about to be dismantled, and Pam was ready to pull the trigger. "Move in," Pam ordered, her voice sharp as steel. "It's now or never." The tension was unbearable as the team closed in. The streets were eerily silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Pam's heart pounded as she watched the team breach the first door. Gunshots rang out almost immediately. The cartel wasn't giving up without a fight. Pam's blood ran cold as she heard the shouts over the comms. "We've got resistance. Heavy fire coming from the west side. We need backup, now." Her instincts kicked in. "Miller, take your team and hit the west side. I'll handle the east. We'll split them down the middle." Without waiting for a response, Pam moved, her heart pounding in her chest. The echo of gunfire was deafening as she made her way through the building. She could feel the pressure building. One wrong move, and the whole operation could come crashing down. She reached the room where the cartel's leaders were holed up. The door was barricaded, but it wouldn't hold for long. Pam didn't hesitate. She gave the signal, and the door exploded inward. What happened next was a blur, a chaotic mix of shouts, gunfire, and the sounds of men scrambling for cover. Pam didn't waste time. She moved fast, targeting the cartel boss in the back of the room. She could see the fear in his eyes as she aimed her weapon at him. "End of the line," she said, her voice cold as ice. The room went silent. The cartel leader, now cornered, knew he was done for. His eyes flickered with the realization that Pam had won. But before he could say a word, a gunshot rang out, cutting him off. Pam spun around, adrenaline surging. The shot hadn't come from her. It had come from one of her own. "Who the hell?" Pam started, her voice rising in shock. Miller appeared at the door, his face tense. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice strained. "Someone tipped them off. We've got cartel members coming in from all sides." Pam's heart dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. The trap was set. The cartel was supposed to be cornered. But now they were about to be ambushed. Pam's mind raced. They had one shot, one chance to finish this. And it wasn't going to come without a fight. "Get the team out of here, now," Pam barked. "We're not leaving until this is done." The fight exploded around them. The air was thick with gunfire and chaos, the kind of violence that would haunt anyone who lived through it. But Pam didn't hesitate. She fought like a woman possessed, pushing forward with everything she had. Minutes later, the cartel leaders were in cuffs, the operation over. But Pam knew this was just the beginning. The streets would be safer tonight, but there was still more to do. More battles to fight, more enemies to take down. As Pam looked around the room, seeing the chaos settle into a tense silence, she knew one thing for sure. This fight wasn't over. The cartel might be down, but they weren't out. And as long as Pam Bondi was breathing, she'd never stop fighting for America's streets. The war was just beginning. The war never ends. Pam Bondi fought tooth and nail to bring down the cartel, but the battle didn't end when the leaders were taken down. The war on fentanyl was far from over, and Pam knew the real fight was just beginning. Every win came with a price, trust shattered, enemies closing in, and the never-ending danger of betrayal. But Pam wasn't backing down. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a force. The streets may have been safer for a moment, but the shadows still lurked. And as long as there's breath in Pam's lungs, she's going to keep pushing forward, taking the fight straight to the heart of the enemy. This fight isn't over yet. Subscribe, hit that like button, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the war that's far from won. The stakes have never been higher. Stay with us for what's coming next.